I've never really been the type to post online about personal stuff, but I think I need to get this out of my system because it's been sitting on my chest for a long time. A few years ago, I worked for a company that I once thought was going to be my career home. I was young, ambitious, and honestly just thankful to even have a job with decent pay and benefits. For the first year, everything seemed fine. I worked hard, met deadlines, and even picked up projects outside my official role because I thought that's how you proved yourself. I figured if I gave the company my loyalty, they'd take care of me in return. That was naive, and I learned the hard way. My boss, let's call him Dave, was the kind of person who wore fake charm like a second skin. To upper management, he was charismatic, confident, and results-oriented. To us, his team, he was manipulative, petty, and cruel. He'd take credit for ideas we brought to the table, but if something went wrong, he'd shove the blame directly onto us. He liked to pit co-workers against each other and constantly reminded us that we were lucky to even have jobs. Every meeting with him felt like walking into a firing squad, and the tension in the office was thick enough to choke on. At first I just kept my head down. I told myself if I worked harder, he'd respect me. But the harder I worked, the more he seemed to single me out. I'd submit reports on time and he'd lose them, then berate me for missing deadlines. He'd schedule one-on-one check-ins only to spend the whole time picking apart my tone or body language, accusing me of being too emotional or not a team player. He even told me once that I'd never make it in the corporate world because I didn't have the killer instinct. It started to bleed into my personal life. I stopped sleeping well. I dreaded Mondays so much that by Sunday afternoon my chest felt tight and my stomach hurt. My friends noticed I was quieter, more on edge. My partner at the time would ask what was wrong, and all I could say was work stuff, because I didn't even know how to put the misery into words without sounding dramatic. The breaking point came during a big project that I basically carried from start to finish. It involved long nights, early mornings, and weekends where I sat alone in the office making sure every detail was right. When it came time to present it, Dave strutted into the meeting with senior leadership, delivered the presentation I wrote word for word, and acted like it was his genius that saved the client relationship. He didn't even look at me once. After the meeting, he pulled me aside and said, "Good work staying out of the way. That's how you support your manager." I went home that night and cried out of pure frustration. Around that time, I started researching. I figured maybe I wasn't alone in this. Maybe there were resources for people stuck in toxic work situations. I stumbled across an article about labor protections, and it mentioned a lesser-known law that requires companies to maintain certain records and provide transparency about evaluations and disciplinary notes if requested by the employee. Most people don't know about it, but it basically prevents managers from secretly building a false narrative to push someone out. I dug deeper, took notes, and quietly reached out to a state labor rep to confirm I was reading it right. Turns out I was. I didn't act immediately. I sat on it for weeks, debating whether it was worth it. I was scared of retaliation. Dave had a reputation for making people disappear from the company overnight. No explanation, just gone. But the more he escalated his games with me, the clearer it became. He wasn't going to stop, and if I stayed quiet, he'd eventually find a way to tank my career. One day after he humiliated me in front of the team for the third time that week, I decided I was done. I formally submitted a written request for all of my personnel records under the law I found. HR looked confused at first, and then uneasy. Within a week, I had a massive folder in my hands. What I found inside honestly made my blood boil. Dave had been fabricating complaints about me for months. There were notes claiming I missed deadlines I'd actually completed early. Reports stating I was aggressive toward coworkers, which couldn't have been further from the truth. He even wrote that I refused direct orders, when I had email trails proving I followed everything to the letter. It was clear he was building a paper trail to justify firing me. Here's the kicker though. Because of the law, I now had documented evidence of false records. That opened the door to a formal investigation. I filed a complaint with HR, attaching my request and the contradictory evidence. HR couldn't ignore it because it was now on official record. They launched an internal review. The next 2 months were tense. Dave started sweating. He called me into fewer meetings, stopped making jokes at my expense, and avoided me in the hallways. I could tell he knew the walls were closing in. Eventually, HR called me into a meeting with upper management. They told me they found significant inconsistencies in his management practices, not just with me but with others too. A quiet whisper started circulating around the office that multiple employees had come forward once they realized they weren't alone. By the end of that quarter, Dave was gone. No farewell party, no announcement, just gone. HR later told me, off the record, that he'd been terminated for misconduct and falsification of employee records. The sense of relief I felt was indescribable. For the first time in years, I walked into work without that heavy pit in my stomach. I ended up leaving the company a year later for a better opportunity, but I'll never forget what that fight taught me. I learned that toxic people thrive in silence and fear, and sometimes the only way to beat them is with knowledge and patience. I also realized how many others were suffering under him but too scared to speak up. If I hadn't used that law, I probably would have been another casualty in his list of ruined careers. I still carry some bitterness, not going to lie. He stole years of my peace of mind. But I also carry pride, because I didn't let him destroy me. I found a way to fight back that he never saw coming, and it cost him the power he abused so recklessly. So yeah, that's how I used a secret law to take down a toxic boss. If anyone reading this feels trapped, please know there are often protections you don't even realize you have. Sometimes the key to freedom is buried in the fine print, and all it takes is the courage to use it.